I've got the stats pulled up here for Will Levis and Joe Burrow. And you look at what Levis did in his rookie season, 1,800 yards, 8 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. That was over the course of 9 games played. Let's start with where they were with Joe Burrow in the 2 years that he was healthy, because it's kind of difficult to track the history of the Callahan offense through Burrow because of the fact that of his 4 years playing from 2020 to 2023, he has really only played 2 full seasons in there. It's, dealt with season-ending injuries in 2020 and 2023. And so I'm going to be looking primarily at 22 and 21 just to get more of a, hey, look, somebody subscribed. Thank you. Just two away, folks.
Two away. We'll just keep popping back
by the end of this episode. Let's do it. Let's get to 1,000.
I'm just going to keep popping back in and out, Well, I'm going to just interrupt you and I'm just going to be like, breaking news.
One more subscriber. But at his peak, Brian Callahan was obviously operating an offense or helping operate an offense in Cincinnati that was super pass heavy. Joe Burrow throwing for 46 and 4,400 yards in 2021 and 2022. 520 attempts and 606 attempts respectively. That's not what the Titans have been for a long time. And I'm not sure they're going to go immediately into that style of offense. Brian Callahan's talked a lot this offseason about how he's going to cater the way that he operates this team to the players that he has. And that's, of course, the correct way, the wise way to go about it. Will Levis has the talent to be a volume passer, but is it going to be in the same way as Joe Burrow? We've been talking about this since February, right? When they brought on Brian Callahan. Hey, Joe Burrow's more of an underneath, inside the numbers, middle of the field, dink and dunk kind of guy. Let's throw the screen. Not to say that he can't throw downfield, and he has successfully in his career, but he's a volume passer that is going to tear you to shreds by 1,000 cuts, kind of, right? And with Will Levis, at least in his rookie year, he demonstrated this is a guy that's going to be throwing 10, 15 yards downfield pretty much every time he uncorks it, throwing outside the numbers, down the sideline, go balls, seam routes that are just goes up the middle of the field. That's his deal, and it's less of a volume kind of attack. You're gonna utilize play action more. All of these things that are just it's a different style of passing. Now that was under Vrabel, and that was in a different situation with different players. Do you think? I guess what I'm trying to get at here, JT, is how similar to the Joe Burrow style offense, the Joe Burrow style of volume, right? 600 attempts, 4,600 yards. Do you think they're going to try to get with Will Levis?
It's tough, right? Because like you said, they're two totally different players. But I think we can look past what Brian Callahan did with the Bengals and kind of go back through his history where we start to see Will Levis's traits kind of align with some of the quarterbacks he's worked with in the past. A guy like Peyton Manning, a guy like Matthew Stafford, these huge arms that were just absolutely unleashing it down the field is a lot different than what Joe Burrow. And like you said, not to say that Joe Burrow can't do that as well, but the Cincinnati offense, like you said, thrives on yards after the catch and having these really good receivers just, slice you up. Like you said, death by 1,000 cuts. I think that maybe we might see a little bit of a return to where things Brian Callahan has learned in the past, finally being able to take over the play calling duties because, in Cincinnati, he wasn't exactly the play caller. He was more developing the scheme around what Zach Taylor was actually calling during the games. But when you look at what they could potentially do here in Tennessee here outside of Cincinnati, you have 3 really, really good wide receivers who, are not exactly the yak threats, but that when you throw that ball up, they have a better chance than not to come down with it. And I think that's
not a perfect 1-to-1 fit. Obviously, Tyler Boyd literally is, but the other two guys, you don't have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. It's a different style, but they are still all 4 volume receivers. All 4 guys that you want to get the ball into their hands to go let them cook downfield.
Right. And I think that, Kenneth in the comments here brings up an interesting point. I think he says it will be similar to Joe Burrow. Callahan has talked a lot about upping the accuracy for Levis, which could mean a lot more short to intermediate passes. And if that's the case, good. But like we said, and why I'm still so skeptical about how they might roll out Will Levis this year, right? The accuracy is a huge thing. We talk about how last year, only 4 interceptions to those 8 touchdowns, but how many plays could 4 interceptions turn into 12 last season for Will Levis? Because if, a receiver or a defenseman comes down with the ball,
just
or
catches the ball that's
just
thrown
catches the
directly at
ball
him.
instead
Yeah.
of this absolute bullet just bouncing off their helmet,
Volleyball
or something.
setting it up into the
Exactly,
air.
right?
Or
So
you
many
don't,
of these.
or you don't have DeAndre Hopkins playing
True.
cornerback for you when the ball
Exactly.
is thrown near him, but not to him. Right.
So I think that the key to you seeing a more Joe Burrow style offense is what Kenneth points out there and what Brian Callahan has alluded to. Will Levis is going to have to fix, a lot of the accuracy issues in his game for them to get there. If he can't, that's where I start to think that you're going to still see Will Levis from last year, where, it's only 20 to 25 passes. But they can, work some of that stuff out. I see no reason why Will Levis couldn't get all the way. I'm not going to say he's going to throw 40 times a game. I think that would be overkill for a Will Levis, still unproven Will Levis. But I could see a world where we're getting to 28, 29, 30 throws a game for Will Levis this season.
On average, right? And a part of this is trying to predict what kind of team, what kind of success the Titans are going to have. Because, if this is a pass-heavy offense by identity, and they're playing a handful of teams this year where they may be trailing. I mean, they could be up in Detroit late in the fall and be trailing by 3 touchdowns the entirety of the second half, in which case they're going to be throwing the ball around the yard. Like, you may have a Will Levis 57 attempt a game, not because that was the game plan, but because that's what the game dictated must happen. Kenneth also points out, Kenneth coming in hot today with the assists in the comments, about how Tyler Boyd has also made specific comments that the playbook is identical or almost identical to what they did in Cincinnati. Yeah, last week when we were there speaking with him for the first time, he did say, I kind of already know the playbook because it's pretty much the same as what I knew in Cincinnati. So I have that leg up on some of these guys in terms of knowing the situation, knowing the scheme. Of course, it's going to be similar. And so that's another reason why I think you can say, yeah, this may be a similar situation to what Callahan was doing with Burrow in Cincinnati. In terms of considering how the situation is going to impact them, at first I'm like, well, it might be a worse team because, those two Joe Burrow full seasons were both, I think they're both division winners, if I'm not mistaken, both playoff teams at the very least. One was a Super Bowl run team. And they both were double-digit win. Like, they were very, very good teams. Top 5 offenses in the NFL those 2 years. And so is that where the Titans are going to be this year? Probably not. So you kind of have to temper. You have to bring back those numbers and say it's going to be a little bit less than that in I think an average world, an average outcome. But then when you consider like, okay, is Will Levis going to have the protection that Joe Burrow had? Probably, because those 2 years, what was the talking point? Joe Burrow, holy cow, 51 sacks in 2021, 41 sacks in 2022. He was getting hit a lot back there. And last year, Will Levis endured 28 sacks in 9 games. So he was well on his way to the 50s if he had played a full season. But in that offense with Callahan, and they did a good job those years of, the talking point was, yeah, well, they don't have the protection for Burrow, but Titans fans know firsthand, you can sack the guy 9 times in a single game, and they're still going to throw the ball around the yard and have a lot of success passing because they get the ball out quickly. They scheme around it. They move the pocket. They boot. They roll out. Like they find ways to not let the Titans of old. How many games can you think back to, JT, where it's like, well, the passing game sucked, and it was because they couldn't, like, this team's passing game was predicated on having some time, and they had no time, and they had no solutions to not having any time. Your hands are tied when you can't pass protect, but smart coordinators, smart coaches can find ways around truly being shut down, and the Titans haven't been great with that recently. I think even if, and God forbid, this offensive line better be better than this year with that additions they've made. And Bill Callahan.
On last week's episode, I confirmed it, so it's going to happen.
Exactly. It's going to be better.
Yep.
That's never come back to bite anybody in the butt when you say that. But even if he gets sacked 45, 50 times this year, I don't see any reason why it still won't be a volume passing attack, a successful passing attack.
Yeah. And like you said, ways to scheme around when things get in trouble. And the best example of that is last year, Brian Callahan in Cincinnati having to deal with that Joe Burrow injury. He was throwing Joe Burrow throws the ball very fast and gets the ball out really quick.
Mhm.
But then they were like, we need to times two this. We need him to get it out even faster last year
Right.
because of that injury. And they were able, didn't have the most success, but that's exactly how you had to play with that injury. Same thing I'm not saying that that's what they're going to do with Will Levis, but having a guy who can also, find a workaround, remake the offense for when Jake Browning has to come in and find what works and what doesn't. That's something that's the telltale signs of a good coordinator who's going to make this work for the quarterback. I think also in while we're still talking about quarterbacks before we move on, we have a couple comments here. Adam asking, why is it always about his dropped interceptions? What about him being top 3 in dropped passes by his wide receivers and dropped touchdowns? That would bring up his accuracy number. And I would say, sure, definitely. It goes both ways. But then again,
well, it's two different conversations, right?
Yeah. I was about to say,
you cannot ignore the turnover worthy play percentage being past the moon on Mars. It was so ridiculous last year compared to the actual turnovers, right? He got very lucky. It is also true that he got very, very unlucky in terms of how often his receivers were catching the ball. Traylon Burks, a 75-yard bomb placed perfectly on his hands, and he drops it. That was also a thing that we regularly saw every single game. It was, holy cow, what a drop by the offense, and holy cow, what a drop by the defense, because he was throwing it to everybody.
And I will say, if there weren't not injury concerns, but accuracy concerns and foot concerns with Will Levis, that things that he needs to work through to make sure that he is the guy, he would have been a first round pick then. There still is the issues behind this, whether it is the wide receivers or not. Throwing to those guys is a result of his accuracy and footwork needing to get better, and his processing, knowing when to throw the ball and when to hold it. These decision-making things as well are a big reason of why he fell to the second round, why this is such a big year for him to prove it.
You look at the Vegas numbers. I went to DraftKings before we got on today to look at what they think Will Levis's passing total is going to be this year. It's set at 3,400 yards. That is right at 200 yards per game in a 17-game season. That is right at what he did last year. He averaged 200.9 yards per game in his 9 starts. For reference, in the Cincinnati offense, Joe Burrow, over his 4 years, has averaged 270.8 yards per game from 2020 to 2024. So 70 more yards on average passing than what Levis did, and granted, a very small sample size last year. Also in those 4 years, for reference with Burrow, 1.9 touchdowns per game, 0.7 interceptions per game. I think that Vegas number is very low, and either is factoring in him not playing 17 games, or the Titans, it's probably a reflection of, hey, Vegas thinks the Titans are going to win 6.5 games, that, they're going to be a bad team, so you're not going to have much in the way of passing success. I think that is dreadfully low. Personally, I think that even if they are a bad team, the way that this offense is going to run, again, you may have some 55, 60 attempt games from Will Levis because they're trailing and they're really trying to throw the ball around the yard. My point all offseason, the number one goal this year is not winning. The number one goal is finding out Levis as the guy, getting him as many reps as possible, even in games where you're getting killed. If that were to happen, I think is going to be a priority of theirs. They're not going to shut it down and okay, we're just going to pound the rock and get out of here. That doesn't serve their purpose for this season. And when you look at I wanted to see what the Titans refresh myself on what the Titans franchise looks like in terms of passing. It's not great historically. There's only been 2 instances of a quarterback passing for over 4,000 yards in a season, and that was Warren Moon in 1990 and 1991. Number 3 and number 4 in terms of total yards were both Ryan Tannehill in 2020 and 2021, so exactly 30 years later. But neither of those seasons, despite them being really strong, I mean, the Titans' offenses were top 10, top 5 during those stretches in the league. Still shy of 4,000 yards, 37 and 3,600 yards in those 2 seasons. And so here's my question to you, JT. Is it reasonable with this new offense, with the expected growth with Will Levis that we think we're going to see, to say a 4,000 yard season in year 2 is the expectation?
I mean, with the way that they're taking this offense, it kind of has to be, right? Like,
I think so.
With the way that they want to emphasize the passing attack, the way they're bringing in all of these mouths to feed, giving Will Levis as many options as possible, it feels like that is the goal, right? To not have him try to hit that mark would be, what is a Calvin Ridley? What is a Tyler Boyd? What are all these guys for, if not to throw the ball
Right.
a lot? Like bringing Tony Pollard in to throw out of the backfield. Like these are guys, Chig taking another step in his game. Like these guys are all going to demand targets, and Brian Callahan is giving Will Levis a lot of options. So I think that is pretty fair to say, in my opinion.
For reference, 4,000 yards, if you play all 17 games, is just 235 yards passing per game. 35 more yards per game than what Will Levis did last season in his 9 starts. I think that is perfectly reasonable. If I had to, and we don't necessarily have to do this for every guy today, but I'm just going to put out what I think is my reasonable expectation for Will Levis from a statistical standpoint in 2024. I think, bridging that gap between Burrow, 270 yards per game, Levis, 200 yards per game in their 2 careers, I think something like 245-ish yards per game is probably within the realm of possibility, which comes out to, 4,100, almost 4,200 yards passing over this course of the season, 4,165 to be exact. And then in terms of touchdowns, I don't know if Burrow averaging 2 touchdowns per game, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case. But even if he throws, 1.5 touchdowns per game, that puts you at 25 touchdowns. I'm going to say 27 touchdowns this year. And then interception wise, I wouldn't be shocked to see him get into double-digit interceptions, just the kind of that cowboy in him, that renegade play style where they're going to have to try to reel that in. That's not going to be an overnight, wow, this guy went from the highest turnover-worthy play rate in the league to the lowest. So, if he hangs 27 touchdowns and throws for 4,200 yards, I think that is probably going to come along with 13, 14, 15 interceptions, to be honest with you. I think that's reasonable, and I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
I don't think so either. I think I might be with you there, that I'd be probably looking in the 15 to 16 interception range, because you have to think, once again, 6.5 wins. Vegas definitely doesn't think that this team is going to, win a lot of games, which means the Titans are going to be down a lot in these games. And what we saw from last year with Will Levis, you can look back to the Pittsburgh game. That's where, trying to play from behind, that's where Will Levis really gets into trouble. And that's where he throws those interceptions at the end of games. So like, just the Will Levis, who he is as a passer, mixed in with the situational ball of, being down by so much or whatever, and just having to rip it. Like, I think there is a very real chance that even with the good numbers that he could put up in this pass first offense now, those interceptions more than likely will come with it.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Thanks for that.
Want more of the latest from the Hot Read podcast? Subscribe to the channel right below.
And follow us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram @HotReadPod for even more segments, clips, and announcements.